Liana was a young woman burdened by an endless storm of hardships, struggling to provide for her son, Kai. With no other options left, she found herself making an unthinkable decision: participating in an exclusive, secretive auction where women were treated as commodities, their presence sold to the highest bidder among the world's wealthiest and most powerful men. For her, this wasn't about choice, it was survival. Seated in a dimly lit corner of the opulent hall, Liana felt the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her, suffocating in its intensity. Her heart pounded erratically, every beat echoing her fear and uncertainty. But amidst the overwhelming anxiety, one thought anchored her. Kai. He was safe, at least for tonight, under the care of their elderly neighbor. Unpaid bills, the looming threat of eviction, and the hollow pangs of hunger that often sent Kai to bed without a proper meal had driven her to this desperate act. There was no turning back now. A sharply dressed man, the event's organizer, approached her with a polished smile that failed to reach his eyes. His demeanor was one of rehearsed charm and calculated control. "Remember, Liana," he murmured, his voice laced with a practiced smoothness. "Maintain your composure, smile, and whatever you do, don't make direct eye contact with the guests." With that, he turned on his heel, disappearing into the sea of opulence. The grand hall buzzed with murmurs and clinking glasses as men in tailored suits observed the women on display, their gazes appraising, predatory. Liana's pulse quickened when she heard her name. "Lot number 23, the organizer announced, his voice rich with theatrical precision. Her breath hitched as she forced her trembling legs forward, ascending the steps to the brightly illuminated stage. The blinding spotlights bore down on her, sending rivulets of sweat down her spine. She held her chin high, but the weight of countless scrutinizing eyes made her skin crawl. "A true exotic beauty?" The organizer purred, his words slicing through her like an unwelcome touch. A ripple of murmured approval spread through the crowd. Then, cutting through the air like a blade, a deep, authoritative voice rang out. $1 million. Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. All eyes turned toward the source of the bid. A man, seated in the back row, his presence commanding despite his distance. His tanned skin and piercing gaze exuded an aura of power, dominance, and an unsettling sense of mystery. Rami al-Fed. An Arab magnate known for his immense wealth and even greater discretion. The organizer, momentarily stunned by the abrupt and extravagant bid, repeated the amount as if to confirm he had heard correctly, but no one else dared to challenge it. Sold. The word sealed her fate. Liana's legs threatened to buckle beneath her, but she steadied herself, masking the turmoil within as she stepped off the stage. Her world had just changed, irreversibly. Rami approached with deliberate steps, his expression unreadable, his gaze unwavering. "We need to discuss the terms," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. He extended his hand, an unspoken invitation, or perhaps an order. Liana hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. As he led her away to a private room, she braced herself for the conversation that would determine the reality of the decision she had made tonight. There was no turning back. The room was vast, adorned with understated luxury. Soft lighting cast a warm glow over the plush furnishings, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Rami moved with practiced ease, his every motion exuding control. He gestured toward an armchair across from him. "Sit," he instructed, his voice measured. Liana hesitated, but obeyed, her body stiff with apprehension. Without another word, Rami walked over to a nearby table, retrieving a sleek, cream-colored envelope that had been placed there in anticipation of this moment. He turned back to her, holding it out. "Here's the contract," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Read it carefully." Liana accepted the envelope, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the thick sheets of paper. The room was unnervingly silent save for the rustle of the document in her hands. She forced herself to focus, scanning the meticulously drafted clauses. With each line, her pulse quickened, the words blurring as her breathing became unsteady. Then she reached it, the clause that made her entire body freeze. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. "You want me to have a child, and then leave it with you?" Her voice wavered, disbelief colliding with horror. Rami met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unreadable. "I need an heir," he stated simply. After the child is born, you will leave. The contract makes that very clear. A surge of indignation surged through Liana, overpowering her fear. She shot up from her seat, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "I can't do this," she said, her voice rising. "I won't abandon my own child." Rami's expression darkened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "You knew what you were getting into when you stepped onto that stage. There's no room for second thoughts now." Liana's grip tightened around the contract as fury burned in her chest. "This is inhumane," she snapped. "Do you honestly believe you can buy a child and discard the mother as if she never mattered?" Rami took a step forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming, suffocating. His eyes bore into hers, unyielding. "I paid $1 million for you, Liana," he said, his voice low, measured. This wasn't some impulsive indulgence, it was a calculated investment. And now you have no choice. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She was trapped, caught in a situation with no way out, no escape. With eerie composure, Rami placed a sleek pen on the table before her. "Sign it," he instructed. "Once the child is born, you'll receive the money and you'll be free to go on with your life." Liana's hands trembled as she stared at the contract, fury and despair warring inside her. Her mind raced, desperate for an alternative, but there was none. She thought of Kai, thought of his innocent face, his small hands reaching for her, his laughter that had once filled their tiny apartment. She was doing this for him. Tears threatened to fall, but she forced them back. Her throat tightened as she exhaled shakily and sank back into her chair. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rami leaned in, his gaze unwavering. "Right or wrong doesn't matter here. What matters is that you honor the agreement." A cold weight settled in her chest. There was no escaping this. With a heavy heart, she picked up the pen, her fingers feeling numb. Slowly, she scrawled her name across the bottom of the contract, sealing her fate. Rami took the document, skimming the signature before nodding in satisfaction. "Good. Tomorrow morning, you'll undergo the necessary medical exams. After that, you'll be taken to my estate. Get some rest." Without another word, he turned and left, the soft click of the door closing behind him reverberating through the silence. Liana sat motionless, her gaze falling onto the contract that now bore her name. She felt as though she had just signed away her soul. The next morning, a sleek black limousine idled in front of the small apartment she called home. Liana stood at the doorway, her heart twisting as she looked down at Kai. Their goodbye had been brief but excruciating. She had forced a smile, masking the pain beneath it, and told him she had to leave for work, just for a little while. She had promised to call, to check in whenever she could. Kai had nodded, trusting, innocent. He didn't understand. As she stepped into the waiting car, her eyes stung with unshed tears. She had made this choice for his future. But as the limousine pulled away, carrying her toward the life she had unwillingly bargained for, she couldn't shake the suffocating feeling that she had just lost everything. The child, blissfully unaware of the storm raging within his mother, waved with a confident smile, his innocent trust piercing Liana's heart like a blade. He had no idea of the sacrifice she was making. The journey to the mansion was cloaked in silence. Liana gazed out the tinted window, watching as the barren desert landscape gradually gave way to sleek, modern structures. The transformation mirrored the stark contrast between her past life and the one she was now stepping into. When they arrived, the sheer grandeur of the estate left her breathless. Towering iron gates swung open, revealing a masterpiece of manicured gardens and an architectural wonder that looked like something pulled from the pages of a fairy tale. The mansion stood tall and regal, its opulence both mesmerizing and daunting. At the entrance, Rami awaited her, his presence as imposing as ever. He offered no warm greeting, no trace of emotion beyond his usual composed seriousness. As he guided her inside, he briefly outlined the essentials: the layout of the house, the rules she was expected to follow, and the boundaries that must not be crossed. "Your privacy will be respected," he stated coolly. "But I expect you to fulfill your part of the agreement without question." With that, he left her in the care of a woman named Zahira. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor led Liana through the expansive halls to her designated quarters. The room was exquisite, decorated in soft, calming tones, the furnishings exuding elegance and warmth. a stark contrast to the sparse, modest apartment she had called home. On the neatly made bed, a selection of carefully chosen clothes and accessories awaited her. "If you need anything, I'll be nearby," Ziera assured her with a warm smile. Liana thanked her, though the sense of displacement clung to her like a second skin. She felt like an outsider, an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. That night, standing on the balcony of her lavish room, she let her gaze drift over the horizon. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but her thoughts were miles away, anchored to a small apartment where her son lay sleeping without her. The ache in her chest was unbearable, but she forced herself to believe she was doing what was necessary. For his future, for his survival. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Rami. "Tomorrow, we'll visit my trusted doctor," he informed her, his voice steady and devoid of warmth. Without waiting for a response, he turned and disappeared down the hallway. Liana simply nodded, though he was already gone. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, heavier than ever. There was no turning back now. The next morning, Liana woke early. The silence of the mansion was unsettling rather than comforting, amplifying the emptiness she felt. Her first night there had been restless, plagued by endless thoughts of the path she had chosen. The bed was impossibly soft, the silk sheets luxurious against her skin, but no amount of comfort could soothe the turmoil within her. A knock at the door signaled Zahiro's arrival. "It's time," Zahiro said gently, offering a reassuring nod as she led Liana through the vast corridors. The mansion's beauty was undeniable. Intricate Persian rugs lined the hallways, masterpieces by renowned artists adorned the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows framed the breathtaking gardens. Yet, despite its magnificence, Liana felt no sense of belonging. Before she could fully absorb her surroundings, she was ushered into a waiting limousine. The ride to the clinic was smooth, the city of Dubai unfolding before her in a dazzling display of modernity and wealth. Towering skyscrapers, luxury boutiques, and immaculate streets rushed past the window, a stark contrast to the life she had left behind. When they arrived, the clinic stood as an emblem of sophistication, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. Inside, the air carried the crisp sterility of a world reserved for the elite. Ibrahim, a man of measured professionalism with a calm, reassuring presence, greeted her with a courteous nod. "Miss Liana," he said smoothly, gesturing toward the examination chair. "Shall we begin?" The tests were thorough, each one a stark reminder of the reality she was about to face. When they were complete, Dr. Ibrahim sat back and offered a slight smile. "Everything is in perfect condition," he confirmed. "We can begin the first fertilization process immediately." Liana swallowed, her throat dry. There was no escaping it now, her fate was sealed. Liana nodded silently, suppressing the unease churning inside her. She kept her expression neutral, unwilling to betray the emotions that threatened to surface. Across the room, Rami stood with his usual composed posture, observing the procedure with detached precision. To him, this was nothing more than a necessary step toward fulfilling his responsibilities, a calculated means to an end. But for Liana, it was a painful, inescapable reality. At the end of these 9 months, she would have to walk away, leaving behind a piece of herself. Back at the mansion, the weight of her situation pressed down on her. Restless and desperate for distraction, she wandered through the labyrinth of extravagance that was now her temporary home. Each room was more lavish than the last, a testament to boundless wealth. The library stretched skyward, its floor-to-ceiling shelves overflowing with leather-bound volumes. An indoor pool, framed by towering marble columns, shimmered beneath a crystal chandelier. The music room was a treasure trove of exotic instruments, each one undoubtedly worth a fortune. And yet, despite its breathtaking beauty, the mansion felt cold, soulless. As the days passed, Liana began to notice the eerie emptiness that surrounded Rami. He lived enveloped in grandeur, yet isolation clung to him like a shadow. He rarely smiled, and when he spoke, it was with calculated precision, as if each word was chosen for its efficiency rather than warmth. In the first few days, his interactions with her were strictly transactional. He ensured every detail aligned with the contract but made no attempt at familiarity, no effort to bridge the chasm between them. Liana, on the other hand, felt increasingly like an intruder in this world of silent opulence. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how Kai was faring without her. By morning, she forced herself to reconcile with the truth. Soon she would carry a child she would never be able to claim as her own. By the second week, Rami hosted a formal dinner at the mansion, an event filled with high-profile business associates. Liana was given explicit instructions. She was to dress elegantly and accompany him as part of their agreement. When she stepped into the grand hall, wearing a gown so stunning it felt like borrowed luxury, uncertainty clouded her every step. The polished marble staircase seemed impossibly long as she descended, her heartbeat quickening under the weight of countless stairs. The guests greeted her with varying degrees of interest. Some offered polite smiles, their curiosity restrained, while others exchanged furtive glances, their scrutiny making her feel exposed, like an object of speculation rather than a person. Yet, despite their judgment, Rami remained at her side. "This is Liana," he introduced her, his voice even, unreadable. "My special guest." His presence was unwavering, a silent assurance amid the overwhelming sea of unfamiliar faces. A while later, as they stepped aside to a quieter corner, Rami did something unexpected. He leaned in slightly and asked, "Are you okay?" It was a simple question, but from him it felt like a rare crack in his impenetrable demeanor. Liana hesitated, then answered honestly, "I'm trying to adjust." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded, as if acknowledging an unspoken truth between them. But he didn't say anything more. To Rami, social gatherings were nothing more than formalities, extensions of his obligations. To Liana, they were a plunge into an unfamiliar world, one she wasn't sure she would ever belong to. Later that night, drained from the evening's events, Liana retreated to her room. Before succumbing to sleep, she called her elderly neighbor to check on Kai. The moment she heard her son's cheerful voice, warmth spread through her chest. But so did an ache so profound it nearly brought her to tears. She longed to hold him, to whisper reassurances that she would return soon, but she couldn't allow herself to waver. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. As the days blurred together, Liana began to notice the smallest, almost imperceptible contradictions in Rami's rigid exterior. One afternoon, as she wandered through the gardens, she stumbled upon him, not in a meeting, not issuing orders, but tending to a single potted plant with surprising care. She stopped, watching as he watered it with deliberate gentleness. It was a rare sight, one that made her realize just how little she truly knew about him. Sensing her presence, Rami straightened but did not look away from the plant. "This belonged to my mother," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "She used to say that caring for it brought her peace." Liana glanced at the delicate leaves, sensing that for the first time she was seeing a glimpse of something deeper, something real, a sliver of humanity behind the fortress of control. For the first time, Liana felt a pang of empathy for Rami. He no longer seemed like just an imposing figure, distant, untouchable. In that moment, he was simply a man burdened by his own struggles, a man who carried wounds he had long since learned to conceal. Though their motivations were vastly different, she realized that they were both bound by the weight of their circumstances, each carrying a heavy burden in their own way. Zahira, too, began to open up to Liana. During the long, quiet afternoons at the mansion, the housekeeper shared glimpses of Rami's past, stories of how he had been forced to take on immense responsibilities at a young age, stepping into a world of power and expectation after the loss of his parents. Liana listened intently, each detail offering her a clearer picture of the man who had, until then, remained an enigma. Yet, despite gaining insight into his world, the loneliness persisted. She reminded herself, over and over, not to grow attached to the mansion, to the life she was living, or to Rami himself. This was temporary, a transaction, nothing more. And yet, amidst the isolation, she found solace in the simple things. The quiet moments spent strolling through the gardens, where the scent of blooming jasmine filled the air. The peaceful nights on her balcony, where she could lose herself in the endless expanse of stars. These fleeting moments became her refuge, a way to anchor herself in a reality that felt increasingly uncertain. One evening, a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Liana turned toward the door just as it opened. Rami stood there, his usual rigid stance softened ever so slightly. The sharp edges of his presence remained, but something in his expression had shifted, an almost imperceptible hesitation. "We need to talk," he said simply, stepping inside. Expecting more instructions, more demands, Liana braced herself, but as Rami sat across from her, he seemed different, less certain, as if he were searching for the right words. "I know this arrangement is difficult for you," he began, his voice lacking its usual calculated precision. "I don't intend to make it harder. I just want you to know that, despite everything, I respect your courage." Liana blinked, caught off guard. His words were unexpected. For the first time, she glimpsed something beneath the mask he always wore. Something raw, something real, a flicker of vulnerability in his otherwise impenetrable gaze. The moment passed in an instant, but it left an imprint on her. As he turned to leave, Liana remained seated, her mind spinning. Was it possible that Rami wasn't as cold as he appeared? That beneath his control and authority, there was someone just as broken as she was? The days at the mansion settled into a quiet rhythm, but each passing moment seemed to add another layer to the complex dynamic between them. They were like two puzzle pieces, unsure if they were meant to fit together, yet somehow drawn toward each other by the circumstances that had forced them into this strange coexistence. Liana could feel time slipping away, each day bringing her closer to the inevitable. Soon she would carry Rami's child, a reality that both terrified and intrigued her. She had agreed to this arrangement out of desperation, but now an unsettling curiosity had begun to take root. Who was this man who had asked her to make such a profound sacrifice? The mansion, once an unfamiliar fortress, had begun to reveal its secrets. Liana started to notice the little details, the way the marble floors gleamed under the afternoon sun, the way the chandeliers cast intricate patterns on the walls at night, the way the air carried the faint scent of citrus from the garden. And the garden, it became her sanctuary. She would spend hours there, basking in the warmth of the sun, listening to the gentle trickle of water from the fountains. It was the one place that felt almost free. She wasn't the only one drawn to it. She noticed that Rami often found solace in the gardens as well. He never intruded on her space, never initiated conversation, but she could feel his presence, watching, observing. There was a tension between them, something neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both were acutely aware of. A silent understanding, a quiet push and pull. Either of them dared to name it. One afternoon, as Liana wandered through the garden, she caught sight of Rami, meticulously pruning a tree with practiced precision. His posture was relaxed but deliberate, his movements measured, as if the act of tending to the plants was more than just routine. It was a form of quiet contemplation. Sensing her presence, he glanced up briefly, acknowledging her before returning to his task. His silence made it clear he wasn't expecting conversation. Still, curiosity got the better of her. "Do you enjoy gardening?" she asked, breaking the stillness between them. "It helps me organize my thoughts," he replied, his voice even, his eyes still fixed on the branches he was trimming. Liana detected a slight opening in his words, not quite an invitation, but not a dismissal either. He was reserved, guarded, yet something told her that beneath his rigid exterior, there was more to him than what he allowed the world to see. She chose not to press further, respecting the boundaries he had built around himself. But that didn't stop her from wondering about the man behind the carefully crafted walls. That evening, an unexpected shift occurred. Rami joined her at the dining table. Until then, Liana's meals had been solitary, brought to her by Zaira in the quiet seclusion of her room or an isolated corner of the house. His presence at dinner was unusual, deliberate. Though calm, he carried with him an unmistakable weight, one that made his presence impossible to ignore. "Are you adjusting?" he asked, breaking the silence as he poured himself a glass of wine. Liana hesitated for a moment before answering. "I think so. As much as I can." Rami studied her with that unreadable gaze of his, as if searching for something beneath her carefully measured response. "I know it's not easy," he said eventually. "But I hope you understand that all of this is necessary." Liana bit back the question that immediately rose to her lips. Necessary for whom? Instead, she simply nodded and continued eating in silence. Yet something about the way he spoke lingered in her mind. His tone was firm, certain, but there was something else beneath it, a heaviness, a carefully concealed burden. As the weeks passed, Liana began noticing small, unexpected gestures from Rami, subtle acts of kindness that contradicted his cold, distant persona. One afternoon, she casually mentioned missing certain foods from her homeland in passing conversation with Zahira. The next day, Zahira brought her a tray of carefully prepared dishes, their familiar aromas instantly transporting her back to a life that now felt worlds away. Mr. Rami asked me to make these," Zahira explained with a knowing smile. Liana blinked in surprise, but said nothing. Rami had never mentioned it, never sought acknowledgement, and yet he had listened. A few mornings later, another quiet gesture appeared. A small stack of books neatly arranged on her bedside table. Liana traced her fingers over their covers, her heart tightening as she realized they were novels and stories she had once mentioned in passing. The warmth that spread through her chest was unexpected. He noticed things, the little things. But the defining moment came late one evening. As Liana wandered the halls of the mansion, she heard something that made her pause. A soft melody, drifting through the corridor. A piano, its notes rich with emotion, delicate yet powerful. Intrigued, she followed the sound, stopping just outside the music room. The door was slightly ajar. Peering inside, she saw him. Rami sat at the grand piano, his fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. The music he played was hauntingly beautiful, each note carrying an unspoken depth. A glimpse of something unguarded. For a man who kept so much of himself locked away, this was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. "You play the piano?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The music stopped abruptly. Rami looked up, clearly startled to have been caught in such an intimate moment. For a brief second, the mask slipped. "My mother taught me when I was a child," he admitted, pulling his hands away from the keys. Liana lingered in the doorway, watching him. For the first time, she realized Rami wasn't just a man of power, of control. He was a man shaped by loss, a man still haunted by the past. "It's beautiful," Liana murmured, stepping closer to the grand piano. Rami's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before he withdrew his hands. He averted his gaze, as if unsure how to respond to the unexpected compliment. For a fleeting second, Liana saw something shift in his expression. An unspoken vulnerability buried beneath years of discipline and control. It was a glimpse into the man behind the mask, the one who held onto pieces of his past with quiet reverence. On another occasion, as Liana wandered through the garden, she noticed a small bird fall from a branch, its delicate frame trembling in pain. Without hesitation, she knelt and gently scooped up the fragile creature, cradling it in her hands with the utmost care. Moments later, she sensed Rami's presence. He stood nearby, watching with silent curiosity. "What will you do with it?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes intent. "I'll take care of it until it's strong enough to fly again," Liana replied without hesitation. Rami didn't respond immediately, but something flickered in his gaze, something she couldn't quite decipher. Admiration, perhaps? Or maybe it was recognition. She didn't know why, but that simple act of compassion seemed to touch him in a way she hadn't expected. The nights in the mansion were long and solitary, but Liana found comfort in the quiet routines she created for herself. She enjoyed wandering the vast, silent corridors, marveling at the grandeur of the architecture. One evening, as she made her way back to her room, she unexpectedly crossed paths with Rami. He looked different, less composed, more human. The exhaustion in his features softened his usual sharp edges. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Liana hesitated before answering. "Sometimes it's hard, with so much on my mind." Rami nodded, as if he understood completely. To her surprise, he didn't leave. Instead, after a brief pause, he extended an invitation. "Join me for tea," he said, tilting his head toward the library. Caught off guard, Liana followed him. The library, filled with towering bookshelves and the scent of aged paper, felt almost intimate in the dim glow of the lamps. They sat across from each other, steam curling from their cups, and for the first time, they spoke. Not as strangers bound by a contract, but as two people trying to make sense of the world they found themselves in. The conversation flowed with an ease neither had expected. They spoke of books, of childhood memories, of places they had never been but longed to see, and in that moment, Liana realized something. She was beginning to see beyond Rami's carefully constructed walls. The changes in their dynamic didn't go unnoticed. Zahira, ever observant, no longer treated Liana as just a guest, but as something more, perhaps a friend. The warmth in her interactions grew, her smiles lingering a little longer. Even Rami, though still a man of formality and restraint, seemed different. There was a shift in the way he looked at her. Not with indifference, not with mere obligation, but with something deeper, something unspoken. Liana too felt it. Despite the reality of their contract, despite the knowledge that all of this was temporary, she found herself grasping onto these moments of connection. Yet, she never let herself forget the truth. A shadow still loomed over her, reminding her of the inevitable. As the days passed, and as the first traces of change took root, Liana knew she had to prepare herself. Rami was a complex man, layered, guarded, and full of contradictions. And somehow, she was only just beginning to unravel the mystery of who he truly was. Deep down, she understood something else, too. The air journeys, once separate, were beginning to intertwine in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days continued to pass, and despite Liana's resolve to maintain emotional distance, she found herself gradually becoming entangled in the rhythm of life at the mansion. Small moments with Rami lingered in her mind longer than she expected. He, too, seemed to take a growing, though restrained, interest in knowing her beyond the confines of their agreement. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Liana noticed how carefully Rami tended to the younger plants, his expression unusually soft as he inspected the delicate saplings. "You care about them," she observed. Rami's gaze remained on the greenery. "I see in them the future," he said. "Something that needs to be nurtured with love and responsibility." His words, so unexpectedly tender, stirred something in Liana. She was beginning to see that Rami was not just the powerful, composed figure she had met weeks ago. There were layers to him, depths she had yet to explore. As time passed, subtle gestures brought them closer. Rami began asking more about her interests, about the things that made her feel at home, and in return, Liana found herself acknowledging the effort he put into understanding her. Their conversations in the garden became a quiet ritual, as did their evenings in the library. They shared books, discussing their meanings, their messages, sometimes debating, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence. One evening, as the fireplace cast a golden glow across the room, Rami asked a question that caught Liana off guard. "If you could change anything about your past, what would it be?" Liana hesitated, the weight of the question settling over her. "I think," she began carefully, "I think I would have chosen more wisely whom to trust. But at the same time, I don't know if I'd change everything." She paused, her voice softer now. "Without the wrong choices, I wouldn't have Kai." Her son's name lingered in the air between them, an invisible presence. Rami didn't press her further. He simply nodded, allowing her the space to sit with her thoughts. Despite their growing connection, Liana remained uncertain. The contract between them loomed in her mind like an unspoken wall, an invisible force reminding her that no matter what she felt, their time together was finite. 9 months. That was all they had. She refused to let herself forget that, but then, on one particularly quiet night, as she sat on her balcony gazing at the stars, Rami joined her. They sat in silence for a while, the night air crisp around them, the vast sky stretching infinitely above. "You think a lot about the future, don't you?" he finally asked. Liana exhaled, hugging her arms around herself. "I can't help it," she admitted. "All of this, it feels so temporary." At that, Rami turned to her, and when their eyes met, there was something in his gaze, something intense, something unspoken, that made Liana hold her breath. "The future can be built, Liana," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "It all depends on how we choose to handle the present." His words settled over her like a quiet promise, an invitation to believe that maybe not everything was set in stone, that perhaps, just perhaps, destiny was still unwritten. The shift in the mansion's atmosphere was undeniable. The cold detachment that had once permeated its halls had been replaced by something lighter, something almost welcoming. The staff noticed it too. Zaira in particular was pleased to see the subtle yet significant changes in Rami. He no longer seemed so isolated, so untouchable. There was a softness in his presence that hadn't been there before, a quiet openness that made the once imposing mansion feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Liana felt the transformation within herself as well. For the first time in months, she was reconnecting with a part of herself she thought had been lost, a part that still knew how to laugh, how to dream, how to feel. But even as warmth began to creep into her days, Liana couldn't ignore the crossroads ahead. She was well aware that the feelings growing between her and Rami could complicate everything. Their relationship, whatever it was, existed in the fragile space between contract and connection, between obligation and something dangerously real. And then there was the secret. The truth about Kai weighed on her more with each passing day. She had always known the risk of Rami discovering her son's existence, but now, the thought of him finding out terrified her in a way it hadn't before. Because now, it mattered. Now, the idea of losing Rami's trust felt unbearable. The morning sun painted the mansion in a soft golden light, but Liana felt restless. The air was thick with unspoken tension, with the kind of anticipation that made her chest tighten. After breakfast, she wandered into the gardens, hoping to clear her mind. She tried to lose herself in the scent of blooming jasmine, in the gentle rustling of the leaves, in the comforting solitude, but peace was fleeting. "Liana?" Zahira's urgent voice cut through the quiet. Something was wrong. Liana hurried back inside, her heart pounding, only to find Rami standing in the living room, holding a small photograph in his hand. Her breath caught in her throat. Even without seeing it, she knew exactly what it was. Rami's expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. A moment. "Who is this boy?" he asked, his voice controlled but laced with something sharper, something dangerously close to anger. Liana felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Her worst fear had come true. She had hidden the photograph so carefully, tucked away in the few belongings she had brought with her, and yet, somehow, Rami had found it. She swallowed hard, forcing the words past the tightness in her chest. "He's my son." The confession hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Rami took a slow step toward her, his dark eyes locked onto hers, searching. "You lied to me." His voice was low, but the weight of his disappointment was far more cutting than if he had yelled. "Why didn't you tell me from the start?" Liana's hands trembled, but she refused to look away. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid it would complicate everything, that you'd think I wasn't suitable for the contract." Rami exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. "And why did you agree to this, knowing you'd have to leave another child behind?" The question struck her like a physical blow. Liana's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "I did it for him," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For the overdue rent, for the bills piling up, for the nights he went to bed hungry. I had no other choice." Her words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Rami didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, as though processing every truth she had just laid bare. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned toward the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You should have trusted me," he finally said, his voice quiet but not without weight. Liana's heart clenched at his words, because deep down, she knew he was right. Liana felt the weight of disappointment in Rami's words, heavier than she had ever anticipated. It settled deep in her chest, suffocating, unbearable. Tears welled in her eyes, and this time, she didn't try to stop them. She had known this moment could shatter the fragile connection they had been building, but she had also known she couldn't keep hiding the truth. Later that night, Rami summoned her to the library. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the towering bookshelves. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Rami sat in his usual chair, a folder of documents spread out in front of him. "I've reviewed the terms of our contract," he said bluntly, his voice devoid of emotion. There's nothing in it that mentions the possibility of you keeping secrets like this. However, it also doesn't address how to handle the situation we're in now." Liana's pulse quickened. A wave of panic washed over her. "Please don't send me away," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll fulfill my part of the agreement, I swear." Rami lifted a hand, silencing her. "I'm not suggesting that," he said, his tone firm but calm. "But trust is essential, Liana, and now we need to rebuild it." He slid a sheet of paper toward her. "I want you to see Kai," he continued, watching her reaction closely. "You're allowed to visit him, but on one condition. He cannot know the truth about our arrangement. Not yet." Liana's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the paper in front of her, barely processing the words. Of all the outcomes she had imagined, this was not one of them. "You're letting me see him?" she asked. Stunned, Rami nodded, his expression unreadable. "But why?" Her voice was barely a whisper, laced with both gratitude and guilt. Rami exhaled, lacing his fingers together as he leaned forward slightly. "Because I know what it's like to grow up without answers," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I want your son to have at least part of your presence, even if it's only temporary." Liana swallowed the lump in her throat. There was something in his voice. Something raw, something laced with an old pain she hadn't expected. For the first time, she truly understood. Rami wasn't just a man bound by duty, seeking an heir. He was someone who had lived through loss, someone who had been shaped by wounds that never fully healed. She had spent so long trying to decipher the layers of his character, but in that moment, she realized, he wasn't so different from her after all. The next day, Liana was taken to see Kai. The journey felt agonizingly long, each mile stretching the anticipation in her chest. And then, finally, she saw him. Before she could even take a breath, Kai came running toward her, his small arms outstretched, his laughter bright and free. "Mommy, you're back!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with pure, unrestrained joy. Liana knelt, gathering him into her arms, holding him as if she never wanted to let go. She buried her face in his soft curls, breathing in his familiar scent, memorizing the feel of his little arms wrapped tightly around her. A part of her wanted to cry. Part of her wanted to run, to take him far away, to forget about everything else. But she couldn't. She knew this visit was only temporary, and soon she would have to leave him all over again. Oh! The day passed in a blur of laughter, warmth, and fleeting happiness. Liana and Kai played as they once had, pretending, if only for a little while, that nothing had changed, that their lives hadn't been upended, that she wasn't going to leave him again. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, reality began to creep back in, settling like a heavy weight on her chest. And then the moment came. Kai wrapped his small arms around her, clinging tightly, as if sensing that their time together was slipping away. "When will you come back?" he asked, his voice filled with the innocence of a child who didn't yet understand the complexity of the world. Liana forced a smile, stroking his soft curls. "Soon, my love," she whispered. She wished it were a promise she could keep. She wished soon didn't feel so painfully uncertain. By the time she returned to the mansion, Liana was drained, physically, emotionally, completely. Rami was waiting for her in the living room, his usual composed demeanor intact, but there was something different in his eyes, something softer. "How is he?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with something she hadn't expected. Genuine concern. Liana exhaled, sinking onto the sofa across from him. She felt raw, stripped of every defense she had spent so long building. "He's well," she murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Happy, but..." Her breath hitched. "It's hard to leave him." Rami didn't respond immediately, but he nodded, as if he understood perfectly. And maybe he did. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't tell her it would get easier. Instead, he simply held her gaze, conveying something in the silence that words never could. In the days that followed, something shifted. The tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet understanding neither of them spoke about. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic turning point, just small, unspoken moments. A shared meal that stretched longer than necessary, conversations that carried into the evening, quiet walks through the garden that no longer felt obligatory. Liana found herself trusting Rami in a way she never had before. And Rami, he changed too. One evening, as they sat in the library surrounded by the scent of old books and the dim glow of firelight, he revealed something unexpected. "My mother died when I was young," he said, his voice lower than usual, as if pulling the words from a place he rarely visited. Liana glanced at him, sensing the weight of what he was sharing. "My father," he continued, "was distant. Business always came first. I grew up with responsibilities before I even understood what they meant." Liana studied him carefully, seeing him, not as the powerful, guarded man she had come to know, but as someone who had carried loneliness for a long, long time. "That must have been difficult," she said, her voice gentle. "It was," Rami admitted, "but I think it shaped who I am today." He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a truth he rarely acknowledged. "And no matter how much I build, how much I achieve, I can't shake the feeling that something will always be missing." Liana felt an urge to comfort him, to reach for him in some way, but she knew Rami still kept certain walls intact. So that moment of vulnerability, of truth, brought them closer than either of them had expected. As the months passed, their relationship continued to evolve. What had once been a cold, impersonal agreement was now marked by mutual respect, by understanding, by something neither of them dared name. Liana no longer saw Rami as just a man of power and control. She saw his humanity, the wounds he hid, the burdens he carried. And Rami, he saw something in Liana too, a strength he hadn't anticipated, a kindness he hadn't realized he needed. But no matter how much things changed between them, the reality of their contract loomed in the distance. The year time together was not infinite, and they both knew that, sooner or later, they would have to face whatever came next. After Liana's visit to Kai, the mansion carried an unusual calm. The way she and Rami interacted had shifted, subtle but undeniable. What had once been filled with tension now held something different, a quiet acceptance. Yet beneath it all, beneath the shared glances and lingering conversations, the shadow of their arrangement remained. An unspoken reminder that time was still moving. And with it, so was the inevitable. Liana found solace in the small routines that tethered her to a sense of normalcy. Her morning walks in the garden, afternoons spent immersed in books in the library, and quiet nights, gazing at the stars from her balcony. But no matter how much she tried to embrace the present, the thought of her son never truly left her. Kai's laughter, his voice, the way he held on to her when she had to say goodbye, it all echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the part of her heart she had left behind. One morning, as she sat at the dining table, sipping her coffee, she was startled by Rami's unexpected arrival. He looked different, more relaxed than usual, as if the weight he always carried had lightened just a little. There was even something almost friendly in his expression. "I want you to come with me today," he said, breaking the quiet. Liana glanced up, intrigued. "Where to?" "I have a meeting at one of my family's properties," he explained. "It's a quiet place. I think you'll like it." She hesitated. Their interactions had shifted into something unspoken yet familiar, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to step further into his world. Still, the idea of leaving the mansion, if only for a few hours, was tempting. After a pause, she nodded. "All right." The car ride was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. Rami drove with an ease that surprised her, his hands steady on the wheel as they left the city behind. Liana watched through the window as the scenery gradually changed, the towering buildings giving way to vast stretches of golden sand, the noise of urban life fading into silence. Nearly an hour later, they arrived at a secluded property nestled among the dunes. Unlike the grandeur of the mansion, this place was unassuming, yet striking in its serenity. The house, built in a traditional Arabic style, radiated warmth. "This was my mother's retreat," Rami said as they stepped out of the car. "She used to come here whenever she needed peace." Liana followed him inside, drawn to the charm of the space. Unlike the cold perfection of the mansion, this house felt lived in, personal. The walls were adorned with vibrant rugs and intricate antique lanterns, their soft glow casting a warm ambiance. The scent of aromatic herbs lingered in the air, adding to the sense of comfort. Rami led her to a terrace overlooking the rolling desert. Here there was nothing but silence, vast and absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Liana sank into one of the wooden chairs, exhaling as the weight of the past few months momentarily lifted from her shoulders. "This is the only place where I can think clearly," Rami admitted, settling into the seat beside her. Liana looked at him, then back at the endless horizon. "Oh, it's beautiful," she said simply. He remained quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you miss your home?" She sighed, lost in thought. "I miss what it represented, a simple place, but full of memories." Rami nodded as if he understood. And perhaps he did. There was something about this place, about this moment, that didn't need words, just silence, just understanding. After that visit, something between them shifted once again. Their interactions became more natural, the tension that had once existed between them dissolving into something unspoken, yet undeniable. Rami started involving Liana in more aspects of his life, not just in fleeting conversations, but in decisions about the mansion, discussions with the staff, and small moments of his daily routine. For Liana, it was an unexpected opportunity to not just see Rami as the powerful, intimidating businessman the world knew him as, but to understand him, to see the man behind the facade. One evening over dinner, Rami brought up an unexpected topic. "I've been thinking about making some renovations to the mansion," he said casually, swirling the wine in his glass. Liana looked up, surprised. "Renovations?" He nodded, something to make it feel more welcoming. She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Rami hesitated for a moment before answering. "I want to create a space where a family could feel at home." His gaze flickered away, as if unsure of the weight of his own words. Liana felt her chest tighten. It was the first time he had spoken about the mansion in a way that suggested a future beyond the confines of their contract. A home, a family. But she knew better than to read too much into it. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many unresolved emotions between them. And yet, the fact that he was even considering such a change meant something. One afternoon, as Liana wandered through the gardens, she spotted Zahira carrying a silver tray adorned with delicate porcelain teacups and fresh cookies. The housekeeper's face was radiant, her eyes filled with an unusual lightness. "You seem especially cheerful today, Zahira," Liana noted, tilting her head curiously. "Did something happen?" Zahira smiled knowingly. "It's just nice to see how things are changing around here," she said, glancing toward the man. "The house has never felt so full of life." Liana felt heat rise to her cheeks. She knew exactly what Zahira meant. The dynamic between her and Rami had shifted, no longer defined by cold formality or rigid obligations. It was something else now. Something fragile, something unspoken but undeniably real. She didn't respond, simply offering a small smile before continuing her walk. As uncertain as she was about the future, there was no denying it. Something was blossoming. It was With each passing day, Liana noticed changes in Rami. He spent more time with her, not just out of necessity but out of choice. He was softer, more open, allowing himself to be seen in ways he never had before. Conversations that were once brief and strictly transactional now stretched into the late hours, their words weaving deeper connections between them. And then, in one of those quiet moments, he revealed something that caught Liana off guard. "I never knew how to cope with losing my mother," he admitted one evening, his voice heavy with something raw and unguarded. "She was the anchor of our family. When she was gone, everything fell apart." Liana swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his confession settle between them. She understood grief, though hers had taken a different form. She had lost security, trust, and a sense of control over her own life. In many ways, she had lost herself. And maybe that was why she felt such an unspoken connection to him. Because beneath all his power and control, Rami, too, was someone who had been shaped by loss. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. No words were needed. Despite the closeness that had grown between them, the contract remained an unspoken barrier. Liana tried not to dwell on it, but late at night when the mansion was quiet and her thoughts refused to settle, she found herself wondering, What would happen when the time came? Would they simply part ways, pretending none of this had ever mattered? Or was something else taking root between them? Something neither of them had prepared for? She didn't have an answer, and the uncertainty terrified her. One night, a knock at her door pulled her from her restless thoughts. She opened it to find Rami standing there. But something was different. He looked unsettled, as if grappling with something unspoken. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Liana stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He sat in the chair across from her bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his fingers laced together. "I know we have our limitations," he began, his tone measured but laced with something deeper. "But I want you to know that I'm trying to understand what all of this means." Liana's heart pounded. There was something in his voice, something hesitant yet sincere, a shift, a possibility. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, neither of them were as bound by the contract as they once believed. "I'm trying too," Liana admitted, her voice steady, yet filled with quiet sincerity. Rami exhaled, as if her words had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: reassurance. Despite the uncertainties that still lingered between them, there was one undeniable truth. Neither of them wanted to face what came next alone. The transformation within the mansion didn't go unnoticed. Zahira, always perceptive, was the first to comment on the change in Rami. "He seems lighter," she remarked one afternoon as she set out fresh linens. "More human." Even the other staff members whispered about how the once cold and impersonal mansion felt different now. Warmer, more alive. And they all knew why. Liana. She had unknowingly woven herself into the fabric of the house, leaving traces of her presence in ways she never could have anticipated. For her part, Liana felt it too. Despite the contract that loomed in the background, she had stopped seeing the mansion as just a temporary stop in her life. It was becoming something more. What exactly, she wasn't sure. But at the end of each day, as she stood on the balcony, gazing at the endless stretch of stars, she could feel it. Something shifting. Something inevitable. Neither she nor Rami had planned for this bond to form, but now, it felt like they were being pulled toward a moment they couldn't escape. A turning point. The days passed, but the atmosphere between them had changed. Their connection deepened in ways neither could fully articulate. Small gestures, a lingering glance, an unspoken understanding, the way their conversations stretched longer than they should, began to blur the lines of their arrangement. The contract still existed, but it was no longer the only thing defining them. And Liana knew that every moment they shared was leading her closer to something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. One morning, as Rami sat in his office, reviewing documents with a look of deep concentration, Liana walked in carrying a tray of coffee. He looked up, visibly surprised, but didn't say anything as she placed the tray on his desk. "I thought you could use a break," she said, trying to sound casual. Rami studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you. Lately, it's been hard to stay focused." Liana hesitated before settling into the chair across from him. "Something with the business?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, just a lot to process." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of unspoken truths, things they weren't quite ready to admit. Finally, Liana broke the quiet. "Do you feel like you've made the right decision so far?" Rami's gaze lifted to meet hers. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, his expression softened. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Life taught me to be pragmatic, but sometimes I wonder if being so rigid has distanced me from what truly matters." Liana felt something stir inside her. For the first time, Rami wasn't just speaking about business or responsibility. He was admitting that there was more at stake, that this, whatever was happening between them, was affecting him too. In the days that followed, their dynamic shifted once again. Rami began inviting Liana to accompany him to meetings, social events, places he had previously navigated alone. It wasn't just about obligation anymore. He wanted her there. And as Liana found herself stepping further into his world, she began to understand the weight of the pressures he carried, the expectations, the responsibilities. So the pressure for peace, the walls he had spent a lifetime building. And yet, despite everything, those walls were starting to crack. And she wasn't sure if either of them was ready for what lay beyond them. During a prestigious charity dinner, Rami introduced Liana as his companion. The moment the words left his lips, she felt the weight of countless eyes shifting toward her. Curious, speculative, calculating. Whispers rippled through the room, but Rami remained utterly indifferent. The opinions of others were meaningless to him. Liana, however, felt the scrutiny settle over her like an unwelcome cloak. "Are you okay?" Rami asked, lowering his voice as he gently guided her toward a quieter corner. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm getting used to it," she replied, forcing a smile. Rami studied her for a moment, then, without warning, reached for her hand. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it was enough. "Don't worry," he murmured, his voice softer than usual. "I'm here with you." Those simple words sent warmth coursing through her, and for the first time that evening, she felt grounded. Their moments of intimacy grew more frequent. Liana began to notice subtle but undeniable changes in Rami. He was opening up to her in ways she never expected, letting her into the parts of his life that had once been carefully guarded. He spoke of his childhood, the weight of his family's expectations, the pressure of upholding the Al-Fed legacy, the loneliness that came with it all. In return, Liana shared pieces of her own story. The struggles of raising Kai alone, the nights she spent worrying about the future, the little joys she clung to in the midst of it all. And Rami listened, not out of obligation but with genuine interest, revealing a side of him she hadn't thought existed. A side that was human, receptive, real. One evening, as they strolled through the gardens under the silver glow of the moon, Rami suddenly stopped. His expression was unreadable, his gaze searching hers for something unspoken. "Liana," he said, his voice quiet yet firm, "I want you to know that despite everything, you've shown me things I never noticed before." She blinked, caught off guard. "Like what?" "That there's more to life than obligations and contracts," he admitted. "That sometimes you need to make room for something new." Her heart pounded at his words. She knew she was falling for him. And yet, the contract remained, an ever-present barrier between them, a reminder of the temporary nature of what they had built. The staff at the mansion wasn't blind to the shift in their dynamic. Zahira, always observant, treated Liana with newfound warmth, almost as if she already saw her as a permanent part of the household. Other staff members exchanged knowing glances whenever Rami and Liana were together, their subtle smiles carrying quiet speculation. But, even amidst the growing closeness, Liana couldn't silence the gnawing fear in the back of her mind. The end of the contract loomed closer with each passing day, and with it, the terrifying possibility that she would lose everything, including him. One afternoon, as Liana sat in the library, immersed in the pages of a book, the quiet was disrupted by the sound of the door closing. She looked up. Rami stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his usual calm tinged with something heavier, something unresolved. "We need to talk," he said, his voice measured but firm. Liana slowly set the book aside, sensing the tension thickening the air between them. "What's going on?" she asked, her heart pounding. Whatever it was important, and it had the power to change everything. Rami sat across from Liana, his hands clasped together on the table, his expression unreadable. "We need to discuss the future," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unfamiliar weight. "I know the contract outlines what should happen after the baby is born, but things have changed." Liana held her breath. She had always known this conversation was inevitable, but knowing it and being ready for it were two very different things. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rami didn't hesitate. "I want to consider other options," he said firmly. "I don't want you to just leave." Her heart pounded in her chest. This was what she had secretly wished for, what she had feared hoping for. But now that the words were hanging between them, she didn't know how to respond. "What does that mean?" she finally managed. "It means we need to find a way to make this work. Together." The sincerity in his voice sent a wave of emotions crashing over her. The situation was still complicated, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Liana felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. Hope. In the days that followed, she and Rami began to speak more openly. Gone were the carefully measured conversations, the unspoken walls between them. Now, there was honesty, vulnerability, acknowledgement of the feelings neither of them had planned for but could no longer deny. Liana allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future with Rami. A life where Kai was no longer a secret but a part of their world, where this mansion was not just a place she stayed but a place she belonged. And Rami, he started seeing something he had never allowed himself to consider before. A real family. But the road ahead wasn't easy. Rami was still haunted by the weight of his family's expectations, the legacy he had spent his life upholding. And Liana still struggled with the knowledge that her life would never be the same, no matter what choice she made. Yet through it all they found strength in each other. On a quiet evening, as they stood on the terrace beneath a sky dusted with stars, Rami turned to Liana, his expression unguarded in a way she had rarely seen before. "I didn't know what love was until you came into my life," he said simply. Liana felt her breath hitch. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't from sadness. They were from something else entirely. Because despite all the difficulties, despite the uncertainty that still loomed over them, something real had grown between them. Something that no contract could define. The mansion, once cold and detached, now held the promise of something greater. A home, a future, a love neither of them had expected but could no longer ignore. As the golden hues of sunset spilled through the mansion's windows, Liana sat at the piano in the music room, one of her newfound sanctuaries. Her fingers moved instinctively over the keys, weaving a melancholic melody through the air. The soft creak of the door made her pause. Rami entered quietly, watching her for a moment before speaking. "Did you teach yourself to play?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost hesitant. Liana looked up, startled by his presence, but offered him a faint smile. "My mother taught me when I was little," she murmured. "It was something that connected us, even in difficult times." Rami's expression shifted, something unspoken passing between them. Perhaps, in their own way, they had both spent their lives searching for something to hold on to. And perhaps, just perhaps, they had finally found it in each other. Rami nodded, stepping closer. Without hesitation, he lowered himself onto the piano bench beside her, his gaze following the graceful movements of her fingers as they glided effortlessly over the keys. "You have talent," he said softly. Liana felt the weight of the moment pressing between them. The tension, the uncertainty, the unspoken words lingering in the air. She didn't respond, unsure of what to say. For a while, Rami remained silent, as if gathering his thoughts. Then, in a voice more measured than usual, he spoke again. "Liana, I've been thinking a lot about what we've shared, about what brought us to this point." The music came to a halt as her hands stilled on the keys. Slowly, she turned to face him, searching his expression. There was something serious in his eyes. Something deep, unresolved. "And what have you concluded?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the rush of emotions inside her. Rami inhaled deeply before answering. "I can't keep ignoring the feelings that have grown between us," he admitted. "But I also know that my past, my family's expectations, they've always been obstacles." Hope flickered inside Liana, but it was laced with apprehension. Rami rarely spoke about his internal struggles. The fact that he was admitting this, opening himself up, meant something. That evening, Rami invited her for a walk in the gardens. The soft rustling of leaves, the cool night breeze, the scent of blooming jasmine, it all created a serene backdrop. But despite the beauty of their surroundings, the weight of their impending conversation hung in the air like a quiet storm. "My father was a strict man," Rami began, his voice calm but heavy. "He believed the family's honor was above all else. I grew up trying to meet his expectations, and it shaped the way I see the world." Liana walked beside him, listening intently. "When my mother died, he became even more distant," Rami continued, his gaze fixed ahead. "Everything became about maintaining control, ensuring nothing strayed from the plan." Liana swallowed, understanding now why he had always seemed so restrained, so unyielding. "And that's why you feel you need an heir?" she asked softly. Rami stopped walking and turned to her. Partly, he admitted, but also because, deep down, I think I've always been afraid of being alone. Liana's heart clenched at his words. She knew loneliness. She had battled it in her own way. But hearing Rami confess his deepest fear made her see him in a different light. Beneath his composed exterior, behind the weight of his legacy, he was just a man, searching for something more. The next day, Rami asked Liana to accompany him on a trip to the desert. They left early, the city gradually fading into the distance as golden sands stretched endlessly before them. The further they traveled, the more the world seemed to slow, until there was nothing but silence, wind, and the endless dunes. When they arrived at a secluded oasis, Liana couldn't help but admire its beauty. Palm trees swayed gently beside a crystal-clear pool of water, a striking contrast against the vast desert that surrounded them. It felt untouched, sacred, like a hidden sanctuary. Rami stood beside her, gazing at the still water. "This place is special to me," he said quietly. "Whenever I need clarity, I come here." Liana turned to him, sensing that this wasn't just a casual outing. This was something deeper. "This place reminds me that even in the middle of the desert, there's life," Rami continued, his voice distant, yet filled with meaning. Liana inhaled deeply, letting the warm air fill her lungs. She understood now. This moment, this place, it wasn't just about reflection. It was a turning point. For him, for her, for whatever lay ahead. They sat under the shade of a palm tree, the desert breeze offering a gentle reprieve from the heat. The oasis felt like a world of its own, untouched, peaceful, suspended in time. Rami exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he had carried for far too long. "I've spent so much time trapped by the past," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady, "by the expectations of others, by obligations I never questioned. I never allowed myself the chance to figure out what I truly want." Liana turned to him, her heart pounding at the sincerity in his words. "And what do you want now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rami met her gaze, his amber eyes gleaming under the golden sunlight. "I want to live differently," he said, each word carrying the weight of a promise. "I want to build something real, something not defined by contracts or duty." Liana felt a rush of emotions, the tears threatening to fall, but she willed them back. Those words, they were everything she had longed to hear, but even as hope flickered inside her, she knew there were still obstacles between them. Shadows of the past, uncertainties of the future. When they returned to the mansion, the air between them felt lighter, yet there were still unspoken matters that lingered. Liana spent her nights lost in thought, reflecting on the choices she had made and the road that lay ahead. She knew that if she wanted a future with Rami, she had to face her fears. She had to reconcile what this meant for her son, for the life she had built before stepping into Rami's world. One night, as she stood on the balcony, gazing at the endless stretch of stars, Rami appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of tea. Without a word, he handed her one and stood next to her, the quiet between them feeling more intimate than any conversation. "You know, Liana," he finally murmured, his voice low, thoughtful, "I never thought I'd meet someone who would make me question everything I believed." She turned to him, drawn in by the weight of his words. "You've shown me that it's possible to have more," he continued, his eyes locked on hers. "That there's room for something beyond responsibilities and expectations." Liana gave a small, trembling smile, emotion pooling in her gaze. "And you've shown me that it's possible to find strength in the midst of pain," she replied. "I wouldn't have come this far without you." A quiet understanding passed between them. Not everything had been resolved, but they weren't standing alone anymore. In the days that followed, Rami took steps to redefine their path. He reviewed the contract, going over every clause carefully. While the details of the child's future still needed to be addressed, he made one thing clear. He wanted to find a solution that was fair to both of them. Liana felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Nothing had been finalized. Nothing was certain, but for the first time, she truly felt they were moving in the right direction. The changes didn't go unnoticed. The mansion staff whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. Rami's usual coldness had given way to something warmer, more open, and Liana, she was different too. More confident, more at ease. Something unspoken had shifted between them, something that couldn't be ignored. And as each day passed, the walls that once stood between them continued to crumble, brick by brick, moment by moment, until soon there would be nothing left but the truth, and the choice that would define their future. On afternoon, as Liana walked through the corridors of the mansion, Zahira, ever perceptive, paused beside her, a knowing smile on her face. "I always knew Mr. Rami had a good heart," she mused. "He just needed someone to help him find it." Liana's chest tightened with emotion. She had never imagined she would be the one to break through Rami's walls, to see the man behind the carefully cultivated image. Yet, here she was. And here he was. A wave of gratitude washed over her, for everything that had led them to this moment. But despite the changes, the uncertainties remained. She and Rami still had to face their fears, to fight for what they had begun to build. Yet, for the first time, she felt something stronger than doubt. Hope that love, real, undeniable love, could be enough to overcome whatever obstacles lay ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mansion in golden light, Liana and Rami sat together on the terrace, watching the sky shift from orange to deep indigo. Either spoke, but they didn't need to. Both knew they were at a crossroads. Difficult decisions would need to be made. The weight of the future still lingered over them. But for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. One morning, Rami called Liana to his office. The room, usually imposing with its dark wood and towering shelves, felt different this time, more intimate. He gestured for her to sit, and Liana obeyed, her heart pounding with anticipation. "I've been thinking a lot about our agreement," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And everything that's happened since you arrived here." Liana kept her gaze locked on him, waiting. "When we made this contract, my focus was on one goal, ensuring an heir for my family," he continued, his hands clasped together on the desk. "But things have changed." Liana's pulse quickened. "I can no longer ignore the feelings that have developed between us." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. This was what she had longed to hear, but what came next? "And what does that mean?" she asked softly. "It means I want to find a way to make this work for both of us," Rami said, his eyes searching hers. "I want you to stay. Not as part of a contract, but because we choose to be together." His words were like a spark in the darkness, a glimmer of hope, but Liana knew it wasn't that simple. There were layers to their situation, layers that couldn't be ignored. That afternoon she wandered through the gardens, her thoughts tangled with doubt and longing. She loved Rami. She didn't need more time to know that. But there was still one undeniable truth. Kaya's son was in another city, waiting for her, needing her. And the contract had been clear. Once the baby was born, she was supposed to leave. Could she truly trust that Rami meant what he said? That this wasn't just another shift in his carefully structured world, one that could crumble under the weight of expectations? Later, as she walked past the central fountain, she spotted Zahira tending to the plants. Something in the older woman's presence felt grounding, safe. Liana hesitated before speaking. "Zahira," she began carefully, "do you think I can trust Rami?" Zahira looked up, caught off guard by the question, but then her expression softened, and when she answered, her voice was laced with quiet certainty. "Mr. Rami is a man of his word. He never makes promises he doesn't intend to keep. But he's also human, Liana, and like you, he's trying to find a balance between what he feels and what he needs to do." Liana absorbed those words, feeling a sense of reassurance, though doubt still lingered in the corners of her mind. Trust was a fragile thing, built over time, and she knew she had to allow herself to believe in it. The next day, Rami invited Liana to visit an orphanage he had supported for years. It wasn't the first time he had done so, but this time it felt different, more personal, more significant. The moment they arrived, the children greeted them with laughter and outstretched arms, pulling them into their world of joy and innocence. Liana watched as Rami, a man so often defined by control and restraint, let go of his usual seriousness. He knelt beside them, listening to their stories, helping them with small tasks, laughing freely. A gentler, more open side of him emerged, One she had always suspected existed but rarely had the chance to see. "You truly care about them," Liana observed as they stood watching the children play. Rami's expression softened. "They remind me that life is about more than responsibilities and business," he admitted. "There's beauty in simplicity." His eyes met hers, the intensity in his gaze making her breath hitch. Liana felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she truly believed Rami was ready to change, to relinquish some of the control he had spent his life holding on to in exchange for something more genuine, something real. Back at the mansion, Rami made a decision that would redefine everything. He called his lawyers, sitting with them for hours, carefully revising the contract. Several clauses were changed. New conditions were set. When he finally presented the updated contract to Liana, her hands trembled as she held the document. He skimmed through the pages, her eyes widening when she reached the changes. Most notably, the assurance that she would have the right to maintain contact with Kai after the baby's birth. Rami watched her reaction, his voice calm but resolute. "I want you to know you're not alone in this," he said. "I don't want you to feel trapped. I want you to stay because you trust me, not because you're obligated." Liana pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they weren't from fear or sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. As days passed, the bond between Liana and Rami deepened. Their conversations, once marked by formality, became effortless. They shared stories of their pasts, dreams of their futures, and the fears that still lingered in the corners of their hearts. Each moment, each interaction built something steady, something solid, something worth fighting for. One night, beneath the quiet glow of the stars, Rami turned to Liana, his expression unreadable. "Liana, I want to meet Kai," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. The words caught her off guard. She blinked, her breath catching as she processed what he had just said. "Are you sure?" she asked hesitantly. "Absolutely," Rami said without hesitation. "He's part of you, and I want to know every part of your life." Liana's heart warmed at his words. This wasn't just a gesture. This was a declaration, a sign that Rami wasn't just offering her a place in his world, he was making room for all of her. The trip to visit Kai was filled with quiet anticipation. Rami appeared calm on the surface, but Liana knew better. She could sense the nervous energy beneath his composed exterior. For her, this moment was everything. When they arrived, Kai didn't hesitate. The second he saw his mother, he sprinted toward her, his laughter ringing through the air as he threw himself into her arms. Liana held him tightly, pressing a kiss to his curls, savoring the warmth of his embrace. And as she glanced up, her eyes meeting Rami's, she saw it. The quiet awe in his gaze. The realization that this moment, this child, was about to change everything.
"Mommy!"
Kai exclaimed joyfully, his small arms wrapping tightly around Liana. Rami stood a few steps away, watching the scene with a soft smile. When Liana gently introduced Kai to him, the boy tilted his head curiously, studying Rami with innocent curiosity. "Are you my mom's friend?" Kai asked, his voice filled with youthful sincerity. Rami knelt to meet the boy at eye level, his expression kind. "Yes, I am," he replied warmly. "And I hope we can be friends too." Kai's face lit up with a bright smile, and Liana felt a surge of relief and happiness. Something about the way Kai looked at Rami, how easily he accepted his presence, made her believe that, even without fully understanding, her son could sense that Rami was someone safe. Someone who mattered. Back at the mansion, Liana felt a quiet shift within herself. For the first time, she wasn't just passing through, caught in a whirlwind of circumstances beyond her control. She was building something. Her relationship with Rami was no longer defined by contracts and obligations, but by trust, by choice, by something undeniably real. Yet she knew the road ahead was still uncertain. Change required courage and patience. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, the stars shimmering above them, Rami reached for Liana's hand. His grip was firm, steady. "I know we still have a lot to face," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Liana turned to him, searching his expression. He meant it, every word. And for the first time, hope didn't feel like a fragile thing in her chest. For the first time, she truly believed that a future together was possible. Life at the Alfed mansion was becoming increasingly familiar to Liana yet. Even as she adjusted to this world, her bond with Rami was still unfolding, still evolving. But after their visit with Kai, something had shifted. Rami seemed different, more present, more attentive. It was as if for the first time, he truly understood that Liana's life before him had been more than just a past. It had been her everything. One morning, as they sipped coffee on the terrace, Rami spoke with an unexpected certainty. "I want Kai to live here," he said. Liana froze mid-sip, her eyes widening in surprise. "Are you serious?" she asked, still trying to process his words. "Yes," Rami said, his voice calm yet unwavering. "If we're going to build something together, I want him to be part of it from the beginning." Her heart raced. The thought of having her son close was everything she had hoped for, but doubts clouded her mind. "And what about the contract?" she asked hesitantly. Rami exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "The contract doesn't have to be a barrier," he said. "We can adjust the terms to ensure Kai has a place here without compromising anything." Liana was silent, overcome by the weight of his words. It wasn't just about the contract. This was about him, his willingness to reshape his life for her, for Kai. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any promise ever could. Preparations for Kai's arrival began immediately. Rami instructed Zaira to prepare a room, taking careful note of Liana's suggestions. He made sure the space felt right, warm, familiar, filled with small touches of the home Kai had known before. He wanted him to feel safe. To know that, no matter how much had changed, his place in her heart had not. On the day of Kai's arrival, Liana was anxious. Her fingers twisted together as she stood by the front entrance, her pulse quickening with every passing second. This moment was everything. And deep down she knew, if this worked, if Kai truly felt at home here, then maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't just be Rami's mansion anymore. It would become something more. A place where love wasn't just spoken but lived. A place that for the first time in a long time could truly be called home. When the grand doors of the mansion opened and Kai ran into her arms, Liana held him tightly, as if shielding him from everything beyond their embrace. His small hands clung to her as he pulled back just enough to take in his surroundings. "This place is huge, Mom," Kai exclaimed, his wide eyes darting across the towering ceilings, the elegant chandeliers, and the endless hallways stretching before him. From a short distance, Rami watched the reunion, his expression unreadable but his posture composed. After a moment, he stepped forward, his movements careful but deliberate. Kneeling to Kai's level, he extended his hand. "Welcome, Kai," Rami said, his voice steady yet warm. "I hope you'll like it here." Kai hesitated for a second before slipping his small hand into Rami's. "Oh, thank you, sir," he said shyly. Rami's lips curved into a faint smile, and Liana noticed the subtle effort he was making, not just in his words, but in the way he softened his usually serious demeanor for her son. It wasn't forced. It was genuine. The first few days were filled with adjustments and discoveries. Kai, with his boundless energy, explored every inch of the mansion, marveling at things Liana had long since stopped noticing. The towering bookshelves in the library, the grand staircase, the koi pond in the garden. His curiosity was endless, and his questions even more so. To Liana's surprise, Rami answered each one patiently. Whether it was about the history of the mansion, the paintings that lined the hallways, or even the different types of flowers in the garden, Rami never brushed him off. It was subtle, but Liana saw it. He wasn't just tolerating Kai's presence, he was choosing to be a part of it. One night, as Liana tucked Kai into bed, his small voice broke the quiet. "Mom?" She brushed a hand over his hair. "Yes, sweetheart?" Kai hesitated, then asked, "Is Mr. Rami a good man?" Liana blinked, caught off guard. She glanced at her son's innocent expression, knowing he wasn't looking for a complicated answer, just the truth, as simple as a child understood it. She smiled softly. "He is," she said. "He's learning to be better every day." Kai seemed satisfied with that. He snuggled into his blankets, his breathing evening out within minutes. Liana sat beside him for a while longer, watching his peaceful face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she knew she was on the right path. As days turned into weeks, Rami and Kai began to form something Liana hadn't dared to imagine: a bond. It started with simple things: afternoons playing chess, quiet walks through the garden. Rami, once so distant, so consumed by control, was beginning to show a different side. A side that wasn't just reserved for her, but for Kai as well. One afternoon, as they strolled through the garden, Kai suddenly stopped, his small hand tugging at Rami's sleeve. Rami glanced down. "Do you like my mom?" Kai asked, his childlike curiosity cutting straight to the point. Liana, watching from a few steps away, froze. Rami was taken aback for only a second before a quiet chuckle escaped him. "I do," he admitted, his tone sincere. "She's a very special woman." Kai beamed at the response and simply continued walking, as if the answer had been all he needed. But Rami remained still for a moment longer, watching him with a faint smile that lingered even as he followed. It was such a simple exchange, and yet it carried more meaning than words could express. One afternoon, Liana found Rami in his office, seated at his desk, focused on a stack of documents. For a moment, she hesitated, taking in the sight of him, so composed, so deeply involved in his work. And yet, this time, it wasn't just his work, it was theirs. Taking a breath, she stepped inside, carrying a cup of tea in her hands. "Can I interrupt?" she asked gently. Rami looked up, his expression instantly softening. "Always," he murmured, setting his pen aside. Liana smiled, settling onto the nearby sofa as she placed the tea on the table beside him. She watched him for a moment as he turned his gaze back to the papers. There was something steady, something reassuring about the way he worked. Dedicated, meticulous, determined. And she realized with quiet certainty that he wasn't just working for himself anymore. "You're working so hard for us," she said, breaking the silence. Rami stilled for a brief second before meeting her gaze, and the way he looked at her then, like she was something worth fighting for, made her heart ache in the best possible way. Rami set down his pen, his gaze locking onto Liana's with unwavering intensity. "Because you're worth it," he said simply. The words were quiet, unembellished, yet they carried the weight of everything he felt. Everything he had struggled to express in the past. Liana's heart pounded. Despite all the challenges, all the uncertainties, she knew one thing for certain. She was building something real with him. Something unshakable. The months passed in a blur, and the Alfad mansion pulsed with a different energy. Laughter echoed through the once silent halls. The bond between Rami and Liana deepened, no longer confined by spoken promises but strengthened by the unspoken ones. The moments of trust, the quiet reassurances, the certainty that neither of them would ever face the future alone. And Kai had become the heart of their home. The little family flourished, tied together not by obligation but by something far greater: love. And with each passing day, the anticipation of their baby's arrival brought them even closer. One evening, as Liana rested on the terrace, she felt a sudden discomfort in her abdomen. At first, she brushed it off as just another symptom of her pregnancy, shifting slightly to ease the sensation. But the pain grew sharper. Stronger inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. But as the seconds passed, a wave of realization crashed over her. It was time. "Zahira!" she called out, her voice trembling. Within moments, Zahira rushed into the room, immediately assessing the situation. Her eyes widened. "Liana is going into labor," she announced, turning to sprint toward Rami. The moment Rami heard those words, his heart stopped. Then he was moving faster than he had ever moved in his life. When he reached the bedroom, he found Liana gripping the sheets, her breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. His hand found hers, squeezing tightly. Now. The drive to the hospital was tense, the air thick with worry. Rami, usually composed, couldn't mask his concern. His grip on Liana's hand never loosened, his thumb gently brushing over her skin as he whispered steady reassurances. "Everything will be fine, Liana. I'm here with you," he murmured, his voice as steady as he could manage, despite the storm raging inside him. She squeezed his hand back, her breathing labored but her eyes locked onto his. She believed him, and that was enough. Upon their arrival, the medical team rushed in, taking over, but Rami refused to leave her side. Through every contraction, every pained gasp, he was there, holding her hand, encouraging her, whispering words of love and strength. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a cry. A perfect, beautiful cry filled the room. Rami turned, his breath catching as he looked down at the tiny boy cradled in his arms. His son. His perfect son. "He's beautiful, Liana," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he let them fall. Liana, exhausted but radiant, gazed up at him with a tired smile. And in that moment, everything changed. This wasn't just the start of a new chapter, it was the beginning of forever. A few days later, as Liana rested in the bedroom, cradling their newborn, Rami entered quietly, holding an envelope in his hand. He looked up, curiosity flickering in her eyes as he sat beside her. There was something different in his expression. Serious. Yet beneath it all, tenderness shone through. "Liana," he began, carefully opening the envelope, "I want you to know something." She watched as he pulled out a familiar document. The agreement that had once defined their lives. Before she could say anything, Rami took the paper between his fingers and tore it to piece by piece. He shredded it, letting the fragments fall to the floor like remnants of a past they no longer needed. Liana's breath hitched. "Why?" she whispered, unable to process what she was seeing. Rami met her gaze, his voice steady. "Because this contract no longer holds any value." Her throat tightened, emotions threatening to spill over. "Everything I've done so far has been for you," he continued. "For us, for our family." He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I don't want anything, not even a contract, to define our future." Liana let out a shaky breath, and as she looked at the man before her, the father of her child, the man who had once been a stranger but had now become her greatest love, she knew he had already given her everything she had ever needed. His heart, his love, and a life they would build together. Rami took Liana's hands in his gaze steady, filled with love, devotion, and something unspoken, something deeper than words. And then, to her astonishment, he knelt before her. "Liana," he began, his voice steady yet thick with emotion. "You've brought light into my life. You've taught me what true love is, what it means to have a family. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, raising our children, facing whatever comes, together." As he spoke, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a delicate diamond ring, shimmering softly under the light. "Will you marry me?" Liana felt the breath catch in her throat. Tears blurred her vision, cascading down her cheeks as her heart pounded wildly. She tried to speak, but no words could match the intensity of what she felt at that moment. Instead, she nodded, choking out the words between joyful sobs. "Yes, Rami, I will." Before she could even process the moment, a small voice erupted from the doorway. "We're going to be a real family!" Kai ran toward them, his face beaming with excitement, his little arms wrapping tightly around them both. Rami lifted him effortlessly into his arms, laughter spilling from his lips as they embraced. And in that moment, in the warmth of their shared joy, they weren't just two people bound by fate. They were a family. A real, unbreakable family. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with joy, anticipation, and endless preparations. Liana wanted a ceremony that reflected both her roots and the love they had built, and Rami made sure every detail honored that wish. The mansion transformed into something out of a fairy tale, adorned with cascading exotic flowers, delicate lanterns, and an ethereal blend of Arabic and Western traditions. Everything felt like a dream. And finally, the day arrived. The sun shone brilliantly, casting golden rays over the garden where the ceremony would take place. Liana stood at the entrance, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She looked stunning, draped in an elegant white gown with golden accents that shimmered with every movement. Kai, dressed in a miniature formal suit, held the wedding rings with pride, his tiny chest puffed out as he waited for his cue. As she stepped forward, walking down the aisle, her gaze locked onto Rami's, and in that instant, everything else faded away. His eyes, filled with raw emotion, never left hers. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time, like the moment he had fallen in love with her was happening all over again. "You look breathtaking," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he took her hands in his. Her fingers trembled in his grasp, but not from nerves. Uncertainty, love, blood. Their vows were simple, yet profound. They didn't need elaborate words, they needed only the truth. A promise of love, a promise of respect, a promise of forever. And when Rami leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that spoke of devotion and endless tomorrows, the guests erupted into applause, their cheers carrying into the sky. The reception was nothing short of magical, traditional Arabic melodies intertwined with the familiar sounds of Liana's homeland, creating a symphony of cultures, a celebration of love that knew no barriers. Laughter filled the hall, warmth radiating from every corner. Kai ran around excitedly, giggling as he proudly introduced guests to his baby brother, completely enchanted by the new life they were creating together. Liana stood at the edge of the celebration, her fingers laced with Rami's, watching the scene unfold before them. "This is the start of everything I've ever dreamed of," she murmured, her voice filled with quiet awe. Rami turned to her, his grip tightening ever so slightly. "And it's only the beginning," he promised. As the night came to a close, beneath a sky painted with stars, Rami pulled Liana into his arms for one final dance. They moved slowly, wrapped in each other, surrounded by family, by friends, by love. It was a love that had been tested, that had broken through every obstacle, every fear, a love that was, against all odds, unshakable. Endless forever, it was the perfect ending to a journey that had begun unexpectedly. One shaped by fate, by circumstance, by choices neither of them had foreseen. Yet, from uncertainty, love had taken root. From a contract, a family had been born. As Kai giggled, playing with his baby brother in the soft glow of lanterns, Rami and Liana exchanged a glance. One filled with quiet understanding, with unspoken promises. No matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, because they had already found everything they needed. Love otherwise, a family that would only continue to grow. And so, beneath the shimmering desert stars, their story reached its perfect conclusion. Not an ending, but a new beginning. One filled with hope and love and forever. What do you think? Did Liana make the right decision by forgiving and marrying Rami? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Let us know.